Hey guys, gals, and non-binary pals, I'm your host Hannah, and this is Under the Scrubs. Welcome back, everyone. We are here on episode 8 today. That means I've been doing this thing for 8 whole weeks, and that feels kind of weird to me. I've gone from someone I maybe posted on social media like twice a year, and now I'm trying to be more present and engaging so that way I can grow, our little community. If you haven't already, go on over and follow at Under the Scrubs podcast on Instagram. I typically post photos that kind of go along with the episodes. I started making little sound bites, and unfortunately, I sold my soul to the Chinese Communist Party, and I started making TikToks. I'm trying to post them to my Instagram account as well, but I didn't realize that IG Reels only allow like a max of 3 minutes, so some of my content might not make it on there. You know that like meme of Steve Buscemi where he's holding the skateboard and he's like, "How you doing, fellow kids?" That's how I feel making TikToks. I don't even edit my own episodes, so I just cringe when I have to edit and compile those videos I take, so please spare me, make it worth my while, and give it a follow. All right, I'm going to jump into my timeout today. I thought it would be fun to share some unfun facts with you. Unfun fact number 1 is if you get a hip replacement, your hip is like totally dislocated from the joint to do so. And it's not like a little tiny baby displacement, right? There's like a special table. It's like called a HANA table or an arch table. And basically like your upper body supported on the bed, like from like mid butt cheeks up. There's a post that goes in between your legs. It's called the peri post. And it's just like rammed up against your genitals right there. Then your feet are strapped into these boots. All right, it looks crazy, but I'm going to post a picture of it. So the leg portions, because they're in the boot, they have like these levers to like turn your feet, like add traction and all that kind of stuff, right? So they'll dislocate the hip, and then basically they drop the foot down, and then like they'll like cross it under, right? So your operative side's basically down to the ground, under the non-operative side. First time I realized that that's what we were doing, I wanted to poop my pants a little, and then I Googled supplements for joint health and Amazon that shit overnight. Unfun fact number 2 is men can ejaculate when you remove a Foley catheter. Ask me how I know that. Number 3, when you do a hysterectomy, like you're removing the uterus, it's typically pulled out through your vagina. That's pretty gross. Number 4, it is better to leave the IUD strings a little longer so that way they won't poke and cause trauma to a penis, because that was actually an issue at one point. Number 5, for hemorrhoid removal surgery, you are prone, and then we have to tape your butt cheeks apart so we can better visualize. Number 6, a John Thomas sign or a Throckmorton sign is when a man's penis points to the side of a fracture in a man's hip or pelvis. This is more of a phenomenon, really, because, like, let's be real, there's a 50-50 chance, but, like, hey, it has a name, why not share it? Number 7, you can develop fistulas, right? Like abnormal connections between things that shouldn't, and women can get them from the colon to the vagina, so you would poop out of it, and if you've ever seen anything like it, you won't forget it, I can promise you that. I said, hey, I have the same setup and mine doesn't do that, why does yours? Number 8, if you lose your eyesight, right, it's not like it goes black. So if you hold your hand over your eye, right, it doesn't see black, it just sees nothing. And the last one is in 2001, there was a study where people were asked to smell a jar of butyric and valeric acid, and the label on it, if it said Parmesan, then 83% of the people said, yeah, it smelled like Parmesan. But if the label read vomit, then the same number of people identified the smell as that. So there's not much of a difference maybe between the smell of vomit and Parmesan. And that's my unfun facts. Yay! So today's episode is a bit heavy. We are discussing physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So if this feels like a topic that you don't think you can sit through, that's totally fine. Skip this one. We will see you next week, okay? Resources for today's episode is Medical News Today, Northeastern University, CBS News, NBC News, People Magazine, deathwithdignity.org, and swissinfo.ch. So come along a mental journey with me. All right, you find a lump or you have this sudden unexplained illness that lands you in a seat in front of a provider, and the words hit you with either terminal cancer, a terminal illness, and you know that this disease is going to take your life. But even though you feel good right now, or you might feel good, you know that this quality of life isn't going to last. You can pursue medication and treatment, but it's only going to prolong it by a limited amount of time. You find a way to end your suffering before it gets, too far gone, and you can go out on your own terms. Maybe you don't want your family and your loved ones watch you waste away. Maybe you don't want to stress them out every time you end up in the hospital. They're worried, is this the last time you'll ever leave the house and not come home? But this way to end the suffering is such a controversial thing that you get mixed reactions from everyone, and you want to pursue research and maybe this alternative to ending the pain and suffering, man. So euthanasia, and I'm going to call it PAS, physician-assisted suicide. It's the deliberate action of ending a life to relieve chronic pain. This is only legal in select states, and they do have slightly different definitions. Euthanasia is defined as a doctor is allowed by law to end a person's life by a painless means as long as the person and their family agree. PAS is a doctor assists an individual in taking their own life if the person requests it. So really the only difference is is family consenting as well. But do we really need a family member to consent to treatment that you want? I don't know. Now, there's a few different ways of euthanasia. You can do voluntary, so that's done with consent. It's legal in Australia, Belgium, Canada, Colombia, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and New Zealand. Here in the U.S., it's legal in Oregon, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Washington State, Maine, Colorado, New Jersey, California, and Vermont. Non-voluntary is done on a person unable to consent due to their current health, like incapacitation, cognitive decline, or like a disability that would require a legal guardian. Involuntary is performed on a person who can give informed consent, but they don't want to. They don't want to die, or they weren't asked. So like murder, right? Or like inmates who receive the death penalty. There's two different classes of euthanasia. There's passive. So like if you are to pursue comfort care in the hospital or hospice, right? There's no life-saving treatment or heroic measures taken to extend the life of that person, but they are prescribed medication that can make them more comfortable. Morphine, which does not kill people, and I will die defending that hill, but it helps with air hunger, so you don't have to, be traumatized while you watch your loved one agonal breathe or gasping for air while they decline. There is room for argument, though, because is this really considered passive euthanasia? There is no intent on taking the life, but, it's just meant to make them more comfortable. But people do view it as such because the opioids can eventually be considered, quote unquote, toxic to the individuals. Active euthanasia is when using lethal substances or forces to end someone's life, either by individual or self. This also is up for argument because now we're kind of towing a line that involves like religion, moral, ethical, and compassionate arguments. Now, there are options for managing chronic pain, right? You can pursue palliative care. Yes, there's going to be opioids involved, but palliative care also addresses other symptoms involved. My issue though, we all know what happens with prescribing opioids, right? You start taking them, you take 5 milligrams, eventually you get to the point it doesn't help you, bump it up, 10, 15, et cetera, to the point that you get to such a high dose. Like if it was ordered and I saw it, I'd call the doc and be like, hey, do you want me to give this pain med? And then like Narcan them immediately after, right? Another argument revolves around the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take, dating back some 2,500 years to do no harm. Now, the OG oath includes, I will never give a deadly drug to anybody who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Now, with variations, we modernize the oath. There's one version that states, if it is given me to save a life, all thanks. But it may also be within my power to take a life. This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. So the Hippocratic Oath is the pledge to practice medicine to the best of one's ability, judgment, and to defer to the expertise of trained surgeons when necessary. The oath also includes the promise of patient confidentiality, but the first OG version actually did not include first do no harm. The misconception of that phrase being in the oath was most likely taken out of Hippocrates' writing, where he discusses that a physician must have two special objects in view with regard to disease, namely to do good or to do no harm. This oath initially appeared in some documents around 400 BCE and the Middle Ages. In the 1500s, Germany medieval scholars rediscovered and updated the document to adhere to their Christian practices, but it wasn't until the 1700s when the document was translated into English, and then Western medical schools began routinely incorporating the oath. Nowadays, there are modernized versions of this oath that medical students pledge upon graduation. Now, I did not realize this, but euthanasia has been a hot topic since early 1800s. In 1828, the first anti-euthanasia law was passed in New York. Naturally, in time, other states started to follow. Fast forward to the 20th century, a man named Ezekiel Emanuel from the American National Institute of Health, he stated that the modern era of euthanasia is being ushered by anesthesia becoming more available. In the future, I would actually like to talk about the history of anesthesia, so keep an eye out for that. 1938, we see a euthanasia society actually form in the U.S., and they start lobbying for PAS because the year prior, Switzerland had actually passed a law making PAS legal as long as the doctor that was ending the patient's life had nothing to gain. Unfortunately, Switzerland has no central registration for cases of assisted suicide, and the Swiss Federal Statistical Office has documented the deaths as a separate category since 2011. So I wasn't able to find anything on their first case. During the 1960s, advocacy for the right to die really starts to kind of take off. Euthanasia really starts to take off. In 2002, the Netherlands decriminalized PAS and loosened some restrictions, which was the year Belgium also approved the same thing. So here in our hospitals and nursing homes, really wherever there is patient care, there exists ethic boards or an ethics committee. And if you have ever had to go before one, it's definitely very intimidating because it often feels like you're trying to represent and advocate for what you feel like is the best way to go about something, right? So you're representing your own feelings and ethics over a situation. Without going into too much detail, I've only been before one ethics board, and it was a patient that was requesting not to disclose an STD to their spouse. They were eventually incapacitated so that they couldn't divulge that information. They weren't going to recover. And the intensivist that I worked with wanted to honor that request, and I disagreed aggressively. We had to take it to an ethics board. I think first time in my adult life, I almost did shit my pants because I got that phone call. I was on a travel assignment. They were like, hey, you want to come in and visit us? And I'm like, not really. So we also have advanced health directives or living wills, which I highly encourage everyone to have one, no matter how old you are. I had created my first one because if I'm unable to make my own decisions, I want to make them now, sound of mind, so my loved ones don't have to make that choice. I witnessed a family that was threatening the decision maker for the patient that if they chose comfort care, they would never forgive them for killing the patient. But how much damage are you really doing by letting the patient suffer? Fear won over, and the family had to watch their loved one just waste away and decline to the point that we were ready to code them. I'll tell you what, if I cannot live my life the way it is now, I don't want it. I can live without a limb, that's fine. I was trying to get someone to cut my foot off last summer due to pain. But mentally, if I am not present, if my future is to lay in a bed with a trach and a peg tube, eventually moving into a nursing home, you pump me so full of ketamine, Versed, and propofol, I celestially discharge. All right? And I'm making that decision now so my family doesn't have to grapple with something like that like my patient did. In 1977, California was the first state to legalize living wills, and other states followed after. In 1990, the Supreme Court approved the use of non-active euthanasia, and in 1994, voters in Oregon approved the Death with Dignity Act, which allowed physicians to assist people with terminal illnesses who were not expected to live longer than 6 months. And then this set the precedence for the U.S. Supreme Court to adopt such laws in 1997, and then a few years later in 1999, Texas made non-active euthanasia legal. 2008, almost 60% of voters in Washington voted to adopt the Death with Dignity Act, and it came into law in 2009. So in 1990, a 26-year-old woman named Terry Schiavo suffered from cardiac arrest, and she was in a vegetative state afterwards from the brain damage from the lack of oxygen. Terry's husband, Michael, wanted to pull the feeding tube, stating that his wife would not have wanted her life artificially prolonged with zero hope of recovery, but her family, however, said, they said, yeah, that's not happening. And this actually ended up becoming a very highly publicized battle in court. It started in 1995. Michael started fighting for his wife to pass. Every doctor who examined Terry said the same thing, that she's never going to recover. And Michael truly believed it, right? He did not want her living in a permanent vegetative state, unconscious, unresponsive, and unable to interact with the world. But her family was in denial, and they refused to believe that their daughter was gone. This case actually led to Terry's Law, which gave the Florida Governor Jeb Bush authority to prevent the removal of the feeding tube, but that was actually eventually overruled by the Florida Supreme Court as unconstitutional. So it's been a long battle since 1995. We're now in March 2005. So March 25th, 2005, these people have been battling it out in court for 10 years. Terry's parents have an emergency request to have a feeding tube replaced after Michael had it removed March 18th. The family has gone through the Florida Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. Congress, and even to the White House, but a Florida judge refused the emergency request. Terry's dad even takes to the media, stating that his daughter is down to her last hours. His attorney is filing a new legal appeal that Terry recently tried to say that she wanted to live. There were protests outside of the hospice facility, many citing religious beliefs for their presence and their view on the sanctity of life. There were individuals who were even arrested for trying to enter the hospice facility. Death threats were being made to Terry's in-laws because of the media coverage and those who didn't agree with what Michael was doing. So Terry ended up passing away March 31st at the age of 41. This was actually such a messy battle that President George Bush was close to creating a constitutional crisis between the executive branch and the courts when he tried to override the Florida's court repeated rulings in favor of the husband. The U.S. Congress even held a special Sunday session trying to figure out how to intervene in the case and have Terry's feeding tube reinserted. The medical examiner, Dr. John Thogmartin, who performed Terry's autopsy, said that Terry's brain was about half the size of a normal adult's, severely and irreversibly damaged, which went against her parents' ideas that she was not in a permanent coma. 2013, a young 13-year-old girl, Jahai McMath from California, went in for what we call TNA, tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy, along with some extra sinus tissue removal to treat childhood sleep apnea. After surgery, Jahai was in PACU, recovering just fine, chomping away at a popsicle. But 3 days later, she started bleeding and she went into cardiac arrest and she suffered irreversible brain damage. She was declared brain dead in December of that year. So when you are declared brain dead, that time of day and that day, that's marked as essentially your death certificate, right? Nyla Wingfield, Jahai's mother, refused to accept the death certificate and that answer. She actually said that her daughter was showing signs of life. She would intermittently wiggle her fingers and toes. And so for that month of December, her mom put up a fight against the hospital who was wanting to terminally extubate, and they took it to court. New Jersey actually has accommodations for religions that don't recognize brain death. So Jahai was transferred there after being released by the hospital, and she was basically treated as a comatose life patient for the next 4.5 years. There's multiple home videos and individual attestations stating that Jahai would respond intermittently to commands on top of, her body, she was going through puberty, she was developing as a young woman, is she really brain dead? This is another case that drew a lot of media attention, and especially to the debate over brain death and religious beliefs. Jahai actually ended up passing away in June of 2018 from bleeding due to liver failure. So how do these two stories tie into euthanasia or PAS? Well, it focuses on quality of life. All right. I feel like we are living in a world of hyperextending life that shouldn't be extended. And don't get me wrong, I'd probably act the same way if I had a kid and I felt like she was still in there, but I also don't know because I'm not a mom and I'm not in her shoes. Maybe I would feel different. Maybe I would feel another kind of way being part of the medical community, but I can't tell, right? I have encountered, though, 90-year-old Mima that if I did chest compressions, I'd have to do it one hand or I would physically crush her, and she's a full code, right? I've had to keep people alive well beyond their own means, and it feels like you're torturing that poor individual. I've had individuals who are vegetative and forced to live beyond their means because family doesn't want to let go. So, spoiler alert, you're never going to be ready for any of your loved ones to pass. You're not going to wake up one day and think, okay, I'd be okay if my dad passed or my grandpa or my best friend. Okay. There's a 50-50 chance that it's either going to be like a Mack truck sideswiping you one random day, or you're going to, be able to anticipate it because like maybe your loved one's not doing great, but it still sucks either way. It's difficult to come to terms with. Like, I don't know what I would do if I couldn't call my mom anymore. And I pray every day that it is extended because I need her. I know reality is that she won't be here anymore, and man, would it hurt, but I don't think I could let my mom lie in a bed on a vent being fed through a tube because I can't say goodbye. This is the same lady that tore her rotator cuff cross-country skiing in her 60s. Has she ever done it before? No, but by golly, she picked it up. I just couldn't imagine condemning her to a bed for the remainder of her life. So something that no one prepares you for either is if you have a loved one that is critically ill, how scary it is to see them in the ICU. And like that's the last image that you have of them in your head. But with PAS, there's people that are changing that idea around it, right? They'll have a memorial and an end of life party so their friends and family can remember them that way, laughing and smiling and hearing all the positive impacts that this person has made on all of their lives. That would be great to basically sit in on your own memorial and, have those feel good feelings. Kestrin Pantera, she writes an article for People magazine talking about June 9th, 2016, the End of Life Options Act went into effect in California. 3 weeks later, she received an email from her best friend, Betsy, who was at the end of her 3-year battle with ALS. Her subject line read, Planet Earth, and in the email she detailed how she was, quote-unquote, preparing her departure for yet another great adventure. Betsy talked about how she had met with her providers, filed paperwork, and was given a time frame to self-administer the medication that would end her life. She decided July 24th at sunset. The rest of the email was an invitation to her end-of-life party, Kestrin responding as easily as if it, were Sunday brunch. And there were rules, of course, to this party. No crying in front of Betsy, only joyful and light interactions, and that Betsy was the only one that was allowed to cry in front of everyone. There was a whole itinerary detailed. There was happy hour cocktails, all leading up to what was called the Sunday rebirth ceremony. Kestrin knew what it was like to watch someone slowly and painfully expire. Her father-in-law had died of cancer. Kestrin fell down a rabbit hole, though, of the controversy of PAS. Will poor people be pushed into it to save their family from financial ruin? Insurance companies may be withholding treatment if there are low odds of survival because it's cheaper to let them go. There was a blog post that told her that she should be protesting against her friend so that way she could give her friend the strength to live on. Kestrin felt like, though, that maybe, this can't be too wrong, right? It's literally what Betsy is choosing. She is sound of mind. One of their friends, Matt, asked Betsy if it was hard to plan her death, and she responded with, dying is easy. Try living in this body. That's hard. The party had tamales, they had cocktails while picking through Betsy's souvenirs, and everything must go sale. And the finale would be Betsy donning a ceremonial Japanese robe, and they go up the hill by her house. The friends would all gather as Betsy took a Jell-O-based concoction of pentobarbital and morphine. She did have to feed it to herself, and within 5 minutes, she would be comatose, and then 1 to 48 hours later, she would reach her final destination. So up on this hill, 30 of Betsy's friends were able to say their goodbyes and see you laters, and Betsy was able to leave this world onto the next, surrounded by devoted family, friends, and former lovers. The states that have the Death with Dignity Act, in order to qualify, you have to be a resident of the state where there is such a law, capable of making and communicating your own healthcare decisions, diagnosed with a terminal illness that will lead to death within 6 months as confirmed by qualified healthcare providers, and capable of self-administering and ingesting medications without assistance. 2 providers, one being the patient's attending and familiar with the patient's case, must confirm diagnosis. They each must be licensed by the state to practice and prescribe. The patient might have a waiting period related to writing or dispensing the medication, and it could be a couple days. There is strict reporting requirements for the request. And any licensed physician in a death with dignity state is allowed to participate if they agree, but they also reserve the right to not participate. There is no compiled list of healthcare providers who participate in assisted dying just for confidentiality and safety reasons. Now, interesting, New Mexico is the first state to authorize APRNs and PAs to participate as well. None of the medical aid in dying laws tell your physician exactly what to prescribe, but all medications under these laws require the attending physician to prescribe them, but it's really up to them to determine what it is and what dose. About 30% of the people who are prescribed never take the drug. Simply just knowing that there's an alternative is comforting enough to them. A 2016 Medscape survey found that 50% of doctors favored PAS, up from 46% back in 2010. Oregon consistently ranks as a top state in the end-of-life care. 90% of the people that use Oregon's Death with Dignity Act are on hospice at the time of death, compared to the 45% in the U.S. overall. Oregon has the best pain, palliative, and hospice care in the nation because the law made physicians to basically get better at diagnosing depression, pain management, and hospice referrals. In 2022, the Swiss Medical Association established new guidelines for assisted suicide. It did restrict some access to the practice. There was concern of foreigners being upset when they were seeking assistance in Switzerland. The new standard requires individuals to have 2 meetings at least 2 weeks apart with a doctor before the final decision. This would create obviously much more expenses for individuals who had to travel to Switzerland seeking assistance. The code doctors have to adhere to were revised in May, so they have the physician that has to conduct at least 2 detailed discussions with the patient separated by an interval for at least 2 weeks. The symptoms of the illness and or functional impairment must be unbearable, the severity of which is to be substantiated by a legit diagnosis and prognosis, and assisted suicide for healthy persons is not medically or ethically justifiable. The crazy thing is quite a few of these facilities, that are across the ocean, require a membership, right? So you give them money, you sign up for a membership. There's a place called Dignitas, right? We'll talk about that. You give them money, and then you pay a yearly subscription, essentially. And then when you're ready, you send in your copies of medical records with a letter explaining why things have become intolerable. And then you give them another lump sum. Okay. Now, those papers are distributed to one of their affiliated providers, and then they decide if they would write a prescription for a fatal dose. And if they go, yeah, I would absolutely write that, then that member gets the green light. They contact the Dignitas headquarters and they will schedule a date and they'll offer you hotel suggestions. And then they pay more money for the appointments and then another lump sum for staff members to organize and witness the death. So a one-time joining fee is added. So for the first year, it's $234 and then it's $85 yearly after that. I found the lump sum being somewhere around 1,860 pounds, which would be $2,019.29 in the US. But that was back in 2009. So I can only imagine what it's risen to now. Dignitas saw an increase in their numbers as well. There was 11,856 members in 2022, which increased 832 people from the previous year. Most of the new members are from the U.S., 380 or so, Germany second, and then the U.K. Dignitas says that over 90% of its members currently live in foreign countries. Exit is the oldest and largest assisted suicide organization in the Alpine country. It currently has 154,118 members, which is the highest number since it was founded 42 years ago. In 2022, there were 17,000 people that became members. Exit explains that this is due to the aging society and the increase in number of people with serious illnesses and disabilities. Patients with terminal cancer accounted for the largest number of people, it's about 37%, who resorted to these measures. Majority of Exit members are opting to pass away at home, but those numbers are starting to fall, and there's more patients that are choosing to pass away in a nursing home or in a hospital, which is wild to me that they're allowed to pass in a hospital when, like, that's where all the good drugs are, right? In 2023, there was a retired doctor, Pierre Beck. He was the former regional vice president of Exit, and he helped a healthy 86-year-old woman who wanted to die alongside her ill husband. Pierre provided the woman with a lethal dose of a sedative and pentobarbital. In 2019, Pierre was found guilty on breaking the federal law on medicinal products, and he was given a suspended 120-day jail sentence. But 2 years later, the federal court overturned the original verdict and Pierre was exonerated, which honestly, I told Chris that if he goes, I have to go with him. But if I go before him, I'm coming back and haunting him because he can't be with anybody else. So 86-year-old woman, I hear you. Okay. The topic of PAS and euthanasia is a hot debate no matter who you talk to, where you go, right? I think being in healthcare, it often gives us a different perspective on life and death. No one prepares you, when you're in your young 20s and you're coding a patient for the first time and you see somebody pass away, right? Or you work on somebody that's your age or younger, or you have to make the phone call in the middle of the night to a family telling them that their loved one has passed. It alters your brain permanently, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. I know my frontal lobe wasn't even developed. There's not an easy way to go about it, so we end up choosing dark humor to cover those wounds because we don't really know how to handle this. I often think of the young people I've worked on, watching the light fade from their eyes, and know that I need to live my life to the fullest because not every day is promised. I know it's cheesy, but it really puts it into perspective. You appreciate quality of life over quantity. If I have a patient who is just so set on ending their life via PAS or euthanasia because they have a terminal illness, they feel trapped in their body and they can't take it anymore, or they just can't take the suffering, who am I to tell them what to do? Like, sorry, you're in chronic pain, just tough it out. Maybe life gets better. I know if I ever started developing dementia, I want out, okay? If I get to the point I get physical with my family or loved ones and I don't recognize them, I don't want that life, okay? Put me back to like pumping me so full of ketamine, Versed, and propofol. And not to bring politics in, but like, I am pro-choice, right? Who am I to tell you what you can and can't do with your body, or how to live your life, or how you should end it? I understand people have religious issues with that, and like, that's okay. It's okay to have a different opinion than me. We did separate from Britain originally, so we could, have a separate church and power. Believe what you want, practice whatever religion you want. I once passed by a bunch of people that were holding lightsabers up and doing a ceremony. Pop off, kings, all right? I feel like we should all be meeting each other in a place of compassion and open listening when it comes to these kinds of debates. I mean, we can learn a lot about each other, but also I think the world could just use more of this these days. Now that this episode has really, uplifted your spirits, I'm going to wrap this bad boy up, okay? Next week, we are going to discuss what I hope is a lighter topic, maybe a bit of a palate cleanser, if you will. Ladies and gents, get your little drummer boy, pick up your fife, and put your little colonial pilgrim shoes on, because we're going to start a revolution. All right, we're talking unions, the benefits, why they actually aren't bad. But for shits and gigs, maybe I'll throw an opposing idea in, okay? And then we're going to talk about the states that don't have them, why they need them, why California has such a badass union that they're the only state that has mandated ratios, all right? I'm at the point in my life, I'm either going to revolt against the government or healthcare, and my fiance said I can't go against the government. So I'll see you guys next week, Tuesday. See you on the battlefield. Okay, love you. Bye.